My sister-in-law stood up at the picnic table, in front of 30-some relatives, and announced that some people in this family had never once lifted a finger to contribute anything. That some of us just showed up every summer to eat the food other people paid for and enjoy land other people maintained. She was looking directly at me when she said it. I didn't say a word back. I picked up my paper plate, walked it to the trash can, and stood for a moment looking out at the tree line at the edge of the field, the one my grandfather planted the year my father was born, on land that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. Land that, as of 11 months earlier, belonged to exactly one person. Me. My name is Theodora Winslet, though everyone in my family has called me Teddy since I was small, and this is the story of the summer my sister-in-law finally said out loud what she'd apparently been thinking for years, without ever once bothering to check whose name was actually on the deed to the ground she was standing on. I am the youngest of 3 siblings, born 9 years after my brother Halston and 7 years after my sister Prudence, a gap wide enough that I sometimes felt more like an afterthought than a third child growing up. The surprise baby who arrived once my parents had already settled comfortably into raising 2 older kids. My father, Reginald Winslet, ran a modest but successful hardware supply business for most of his working life, and my mother, Cordelia, kept the books for him and raised the 3 of us on a farm property just outside a small town in the Blue Ridge foothills, 60 acres that had been in the family since my great-grandfather cleared it himself in the early part of the last century. That land is the center of this entire story, so I want to describe it properly. It's beautiful in an unshowy way, rolling pasture giving way to a stand of old oak and hickory at the back edge, a creek running through the low part of the property that floods gently every spring and then settles back into a quiet trickle by midsummer. My grandfather built the original farmhouse. My father added onto it twice over the decades. And every single year of my life, without exception, that land had hosted the Winslet family reunion, an enormous, sprawling gathering every July that brought together cousins and aunts and second cousins twice removed, some of whom I only ever saw at that single yearly event. I loved that land the way you love something that raised you alongside your own parents. I spent my childhood catching crawfish in that creek, my adolescence hiding from family gatherings in the branches of that old oak tree, my early adulthood bringing boyfriends home to meet my parents on that same wide front porch. It was, in every sense that mattered to me, home. My siblings had a more complicated relationship with it, though I didn't fully understand how complicated until much later. Halston, for years my senior in every practical sense of ambition, left for the city the moment he turned 18 and built a career in commercial real estate, the kind of career that came with a large downtown condo and a wife, Ginevra, who I don't think ever once set foot on our family's land without commenting, in some carefully polite way, on how rustic or quaint everything was. Prudence stayed somewhat closer, married a contractor named Osric Fenmore, and settled into a comfortable suburban life about 40 minutes from our parents, close enough for regular visits, but far enough, I think, to feel like her own separate life. I was the only one who stayed genuinely close, in every sense. I never left the area at all, building a modest career as a veterinary technician at a large animal practice that served most of the farms in the county, and I moved into a small cottage on the back corner of my parents' land when I was 26. Paying them a nominal rent that we both understood was more symbolic than real. I was there for every ordinary Tuesday, every unremarkable Sunday dinner, every small crisis that never made it into the family group chat because it wasn't dramatic enough to mention, just the accumulated weight of actually being present. Year after year, in a way my siblings, with their busier, more distant lives, simply weren't. I want to be honest that I never resented this arrangement, not for a long time. I liked being close to my parents. I liked the land. I liked the quiet, unglamorous rhythm of a life that didn't require constant travel or constant performance. What I didn't fully understand, until it was explained to me much later, was how differently this arrangement was being perceived by the family members who weren't living it. Ginevra, Halston's wife, had never been particularly warm toward me, in the specific way some people are cool toward relatives they've quietly decided aren't quite as accomplished as themselves. She ran a successful event planning company in the city, dressed impeccably even at casual family gatherings, and had a way of asking about my job that always managed to sound like a gentle, condescending question about when I might find something more serious to do with my life. I let most of these comments roll off me over the years, the way you learn to let things roll off you when you've decided a relationship simply isn't worth the friction of correcting every small slight. What I did not fully understand, until the reunion I'm about to describe, was that Ginevra had apparently spent years quietly constructing a narrative, both to herself and, I would later learn, to plenty of other relatives, in which I was essentially a freeloader living rent-free on land my parents would eventually divide equally among all three of their children, contributing nothing of substance, while my more successful, more distant siblings funded the real costs of maintaining a family. Legacy from afar. This narrative, I should say clearly, was not accurate in almost any respect, but I did not know, for a long time, that it existed at all. My father passed 4 years ago, from complications following a stroke, quickly and, mercifully, without a long, painful decline. My mother, in the years since, had remained on the property, though her health had begun to decline more gradually, arthritis making the old farmhouse's stairs increasingly difficult, her memory occasionally slipping in small, worrying ways that made all three of us start having quiet, careful conversations about what her long-term care might eventually require. What none of my siblings knew, because my mother had asked me specifically to keep it private until the right moment, was that 2 years before my father's death, my parents had made a decision about the land's future that diverged significantly from what everyone in the family had always assumed. I need to explain the assumption first, because it matters enormously to what happened later. For as long as I could remember, it had simply been understood, in the vague, unspoken way families understand things without ever formally discussing them, that the land would eventually be divided 3 ways between Halston, Prudence, and me. Once our parents were gone. Nobody had ever seen a will. Nobody had ever asked to see one, honestly, because families like ours generally didn't discuss inheritance directly while parents were still alive. It was considered a little morbid, a little presumptuous. But the assumption sat there anyway, unspoken and unchallenged, for decades. My parents' actual thinking, as they explained it to me directly during a long conversation on the front porch one evening 6 years ago, was considerably more deliberate than that vague family assumption suggested. Your brother has a career that will provide for him comfortably for the rest of his life, my father told me that evening, my mother sitting beside him, nodding along. Your sister married well, and Osric's business does fine. Neither of them has ever shown the slightest interest in this land beyond what it might eventually be worth if it were sold. You're the only one who's ever actually loved it the way we do, Teddy. The only one who's ever shown up, year after year, without being asked, without needing anything in return. They told me, that evening, that they intended to leave the land to me outright, with a separate, roughly equivalent sum from their other savings and investments divided between Halston and Prudence, structured so that the overall inheritance remained fair in total value, but ensured the land itself, the actual 60 acres and the farmhouse standing on it, would pass to the one child who had genuinely built a life around caring for it. I was stunned, honestly, and a little uncomfortable with the arrangement at first, worried about exactly the kind of family tension it might eventually cause. My parents, to their credit, had thought this through carefully. They worked with a careful, thorough attorney named Percival Nakamura to draft the estate plan properly, including a clear, documented explanation of their reasoning, meant to head off exactly the kind of confusion or resentment that vague, undocumented family assumptions often produce after a parent's death. They asked me to keep the details private for the time being, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because they wanted to have the conversation with Halston and Prudence themselves, in their own time, in their own way, rather than having it filter out through me or through gossip. My father's stroke, unfortunately, happened before that conversation ever took place. He died with the estate plan fully in place, legally sound and properly executed, but with his own children still operating under the old, vague assumption that the land would eventually be split 3 ways. My mother, grieving and overwhelmed in the aftermath of my father's death, did not have the conversation with my siblings either in those first difficult months. And I, respecting her private process of grief, did not push her to have it before she was ready, though I understood, even then, that this silence was building toward a reckoning none of us were fully prepared for. The reckoning came, unexpectedly, 11 months ago, when my mother, increasingly aware of her own declining health, finally executed the formal transfer of the property deed into my name alone. Exactly as she and my father had planned years earlier, working again with Percival to ensure everything was handled cleanly and legally while she was still fully capable of making that decision herself. She told Halston and Prudence about it shortly afterward, in a phone call I was not part of, and I know now, from what each of them later told me separately, that the conversation did not go smoothly. Halston, by his own later admission, was quietly hurt but ultimately accepting, his own financial situation comfortable enough that the land's monetary value mattered less to him than the principle of the thing. Prudence, I believe, was genuinely more conflicted, caught between her own complicated feelings and her husband Osric's more openly resentful reaction to the news. But it was Ginevra, Halston's wife, who apparently reacted with the most open, sustained anger, an anger that, as I would learn, she did not express directly to my mother or to me at the time, but instead nursed privately, reshaping the entire situation, in her own retelling to friends, and even to some extended family members, into a story about manipulation and favoritism, in which I had somehow schemed my way into inheriting land that rightfully belonged to all 3 siblings equally. I did not know any of this was happening, not fully, until the reunion this past July. The reunion, as always, was held on the land, under the same old oak trees, at the same picnic tables my father had built decades earlier. I had spent the week before it, as I did every year, doing the bulk of the actual preparation, mowing the field, setting up the tents in case of rain, coordinating with the caterers my mother had used for years, making sure the old farmhouse bathroom was stocked and functioning for the day's use. This was not new. I had done this every single year of my adult life, the quiet, unglamorous labor of hosting that nobody particularly notices until it fails to happen. About 2 hours into the gathering, once most of the extended family had arrived and settled into the familiar rhythms of a reunion, children running through the field, older relatives finding shade under the tents, the smell of the caterer's barbecue drifting across the property, a disagreement broke out near the edge of the field over something that seemed small at first, but would end up cracking the whole day open. A cousin's teenage son had set up a volleyball net near the tree line, close to the boundary where our property met the neighboring Kesseling farm, and, in the process of setting stakes, had inadvertently damaged a section of fencing that marked the actual property line, a line that had been mildly disputed, in a friendly, low-stakes way, between our family and the Kesselings for years. Old Silas Kesseling, who still farmed the adjoining property, drove over in his truck once he noticed the disturbance, understandably frustrated, and a conversation began, in front of most of the assembled family, about exactly where the property line actually sat and who had the authority to resolve it. Halston, trying to be helpful in the way people sometimes try to be helpful without actually having the relevant information, started explaining to Silas that the family would sort it out, that we owned the land jointly, that he'd loop in his sister and his mother, and they'd figure out a fair resolution. I stepped in at that point, gently, and explained, for the first time out loud in front of the full extended family, that the property was actually held solely in my name now, that I was the one who'd need to formally address the boundary question with Silas, and that I'd be glad to have him back out with the original survey the following week to sort it out properly. The field went quiet in that particular way a field full of people goes quiet when something unexpected has just been said out loud. It was Ginevra who broke the silence, and not gently. "Solely in your name," she repeated, her voice carrying easily across the picnic tables. "Right. Of course it is." I remember looking at her, genuinely unsure at first what she meant, before she continued, standing up now from the picnic bench, her voice rising with what I understood, looking back. Was months of quietly accumulated resentment finally finding an audience? I think it's worth saying, since apparently we're all being honest today, she said, that some people in this family have never once contributed anything real. Some of us fly down here every single year, pay for half the groceries, bring the good wine, help fund the catering when Cordelia's budget got tight after Reginald passed, while other people just live here rent-free and somehow end up owning everything. I'm sorry, but somebody had to say it. It's not fair, and everyone here knows it's not fair, they're just too polite to say so. I want to describe what I felt in that moment as honestly as I can, because I think it matters more than any clever response I might have given. I did not feel rage, exactly, standing there in front of 30-some relatives, most of whom were now looking somewhere between the ground and me, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. What I felt was something closer to a strange, quiet clarity, the specific feeling of finally understanding a resentment that had apparently been simmering for years without my ever fully realizing it existed. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my paper plate, walked it calmly to the trash can near the tents, and stood there for a moment, looking out at the tree line, giving myself the space to decide how I actually wanted to respond, rather than reacting purely out of hurt. When I turned back around, the field was still quiet, still watching. You're right that it's worth being honest today, I said, and I kept my voice level, the way you keep your voice level when you've decided, consciously, not to let anger drive the moment. So, let's actually be honest. This land was left to me by my parents, deliberately, in a properly documented estate plan, because I'm the one who's spent 30 years actually taking care of it, not because I schemed for it or manipulated anyone. My mother and father made that decision together, years before my father died, and they made sure Halston and Prudence received an equivalent value in other assets so that the overall inheritance stayed fair. That's not favoritism, Ginevra. That's simply what my parents decided was fair, based on who actually showed up for this place, year after year, without being asked. Ginevra opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. And since we're being honest, I continued, I'd also like to point out that you're currently standing on land I own outright, at a reunion I spent the entire week preparing, eating food I helped select and pay for, same as every single year of my adult life. I don't say that to be petty. I say it because you just stood up in front of this entire family and called me a freeloader, on my own property, at an event I hosted. And I think everyone here deserves to actually understand the full picture before that word gets repeated at another family gathering. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Longer, heavier, the kind of silence that happens when a room, or in this case a field, is genuinely absorbing something rather than simply waiting for an argument to end. Halston, to his credit, stepped in at that point, quietly telling Ginevra that this wasn't the time or place, his voice carrying an edge of real embarrassment that suggested this wasn't entirely news to him, that some version of this resentment had likely come up between them privately before. Prudence, I noticed, said nothing at all, though she caught my eye across the field with an expression that looked, unmistakably, like quiet apology. My mother, who had been sitting under one of the tents for most of the confrontation, too far to have heard every word clearly, but close enough to understand the shape of it, called me over once things had settled back into an uneasy version of normal. She took my hand, and she said, quietly, just for me, I should have had that conversation with all three of you together, years ago, instead of letting it sit as a secret. I'm sorry you had to defend yourself like that today, Teddy. That was never how I wanted this to come out. I told her it was all right, and I meant it, though it would take me some time afterward to actually believe that fully. The weeks following the reunion were, honestly, some of the most difficult of that entire year, harder in some ways than the confrontation itself. Halston called me a few days later, apologizing, somewhat awkwardly, for not defending me more directly in the moment, explaining that he and Ginevra had been having a difficult stretch in their marriage more broadly. Financial pressures from a slower year in her event planning business that had apparently made the land's value feel more urgent to her than it might have otherwise. It wasn't an excuse, he said, just context, and I appreciated him being honest about it rather than pretending the outburst had come from nowhere. Prudence came to see me in person about 2 weeks later, sitting with me on the same front porch where my parents had once told me about their plans for the land. She admitted that she'd felt genuine hurt when she first learned about the inheritance arrangement, not because she doubted my parents' reasoning, but because it had forced her to confront something uncomfortable about her own life, the way distance. Even chosen distance has real costs that are easy to underestimate until you're forced to see them laid out plainly. I think some part of me always knew you were the one actually holding this family together, out here, she told me. It's easier to resent someone for having something than to admit you never really wanted to do the work required to earn it yourself. Ginevra did not apologize immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think pretending every difficult family conflict resolves neatly and quickly does a disservice to how these things actually work. It took nearly 4 months, and what I understand was a fairly serious separate conversation between her and Halston before she reached out to me directly, in a careful, somewhat stiff email that acknowledged she'd spoken out of turn, out of her own private frustrations that had nothing to do with me directly, and that she regretted embarrassing me in front of the whole family, whatever her feelings about the underlying arrangement. I accepted the apology, though I told her honestly that trust, in a relationship that had never been especially warm to begin with, would take longer than a single email to rebuild. The boundary dispute with Silas Kesseling, as it happened, resolved itself simply and amicably within a few weeks, through a proper survey that confirmed our family's fence line had, in fact, always been correctly placed, a small, almost anticlimactic footnote to a day that had cracked open something far more significant than a few feet of disputed pasture. This past July, we held the reunion again on the same land under the same oak trees. I hosted it again, the way I always had, mowing the field the week before, coordinating with the caterer, making sure the old farmhouse was ready for the day's use. Ginevra came again too, quieter this year, helping set up chairs without being asked, a small gesture that I understood, in its own modest way, as its own kind of apology, more meaningful, honestly, than the email had been. Near the end of the day, as the light started going gold over the field the way it always does in late July, my mother found me near the same tree line where I'd stood the year before, absorbing Ginevra's accusation in silence. "Your father would be proud of how you handled that," she said, meaning I understood, not just the confrontation at last year's reunion, but the whole quiet shape of the life I'd built. Showing up year after year for a piece of land and a family that hadn't always fully seen what that showing up actually cost or actually meant. I told her I hoped so. And then, because it was true, and because I finally felt no need to say it defensively, I told her I was glad, whatever the complications, that the land belonged to someone who genuinely loved it and that I intended, someday, to make sure it stayed that way, passed down again to whoever in the next generation showed up the way I had, rather than simply divided by old assumptions nobody had ever bothered to actually examine. If someone stood in a place you built, ate food you provided, and called you a freeloader in front of everyone you loved, what would you have done? Would you have argued right there in the heat of it? Or would you have done what I did, and let the quiet, documented truth speak for itself, exactly when it mattered most?